talk about my view of how Dr. King's vision is the vision that we're working for when we're talking about ending the death penalty. And I want to start by observing the synchronicity of today. Synchronicity is the idea that there's an alignment of seemingly unrelated events, but that there's a meaning in that alignment. So let me start with one. This is the morning that we officially celebrate Dr. King's birthday. But it's also the morning that we are officially celebrating the inauguration of our nation's first African American. Regardless of your political affiliation, you have to celebrate the progress and the triumph of the democratic process that represents. And so, I got up this morning and I was hoping to catch a glimpse of the inauguration, because actually I came from D.C. And I didn't get that on the channel. What I ended up seeing was a story on the History Channel about Dr. King. And again, it was very appropriate for this morning because it was talking about the struggle, and there was somebody saying, the further we get away from, Dr. King's original birthday and the civil rights struggle, sort of the more watered down that story becomes. It becomes sort of a dream. It's kind of like, but this story this morning sort of reminded me of the grit and the sacrifice of people. And it also reminded me, lifted up that the change came when young people got involved. It was that young people's march where the public saw the brutality that was visited upon those young people, those children, that began to change the heart and mind. So there's a lesson here in that. We're here at Colorado College. There's so many young people here because part of Dr. King's vision is not only the importance of all of us getting involved, but the importance of young people carrying it forward. So is that synchronicity or is that legacy? The other thing that I observed about Dr. King is that he had a vision that was bigger than himself. He had a vision that could see beyond the ugly face of Jim Crow and the generation upon generation of dreams deferred. He had a vision of hope and light, and I think that vision of hope and light is what has drawn this country to it. Sometimes willingly, sometimes kicking and fighting and through blood and violence, but nevertheless, that vision of light is what we're all drawn to, which is what's drawing us all here. It's a vision of a country and a people and a way of being with each other that is bigger and better than what we have now. Hope. Is that synchronicity or legacy? Even before today, on January 15th, Dr. King's actual birthday, I stood with President Benjamin Jealous of the NAACP in Maryland, along with the governor of that state, as he and members of the Legislative Black Caucus of that state announced that they would be moving to repeal the death penalty in that state, that bill will be introduced in this short session, and within the next 90 days, we will see the death penalty ended in Maryland. People who had labored for years could finally see in that packed room with the energy there that vision was going to come to fruition. There was a man there who brought us all to tears, who talked about his wife, who had worked in Virginia for years as a lawyer, representing clients on death row, and made her life's work working against death penalty. And he said something reminiscent of poetry, and we have to have, can we please do this now? His wife is suffering prematurely with early onset Alzheimer's. He says, I don't have a lot of time. I've got to get this done. I don't even know whether she will even understand all that's going on, but when we pass this bill, I want to go home and tell my wife that we've ended the death penalty in Maryland. And so there was a special urgency there. I also want to make a point about the importance of ending the death penalty in Maryland that was driven home when they said, some people might say, why all this fuss about ending the death penalty in Maryland? Well, after all, you all haven't used it. You have a small death row. But Benjamin Jealous made a very important point. He said, you know, we've got to get the death penalty in Maryland to get to Texas and Alabama and Mississippi. And so I would say to you in Colorado that ending the death penalty in Colorado is important because it's important about how your justice system works here. But it's also important because when you end the death penalty in Colorado, that's the way through to Texas, Virginia, and Georgia. I'm going to talk about in a little bit. I want to acknowledge all the people who have worked so hard to get here. Rosemary, Roger, Frank got me here, Sheila I just met. It's been a wonderful remembrance of how much of a family we really are, how much we're pulling together to do this. And again, that is Dr. King's legacy. So here are my reflections on Dr. King and what it means today. And, you know, the timing on this is great. You know, coming on the heels of Christmas and Kwanzaa, where we think about what are our goals and our plans for the coming year. It's time we reflect on our ancestors and what they would want for us. And so it was a good time for me to be thinking about Dr. King and what it means in terms of my own work going forward. And for me, this Christmas was especially precious. You know, I watched as my parents themselves are aging. My mother's about the same age as Dr. King would have been. And I'm watching as they are gracefully dealing with the challenges and changes of aging. And for us, it was a special Christmas because it was very important for it to be the Christmas the way it usually is. The kids' stockings are up, and even though they couldn't do as much as they once were able to do. So there was a special preciousness about this Christmas with my parents as they grappled with grace with these changes and our family. It was also a special Christmas because I watched as my own two sons began to reconnect with their dad, who's been away and separated by space and time, and so I saw the beginning of healing. So for me, it was a particularly special Christmas in terms of what it represented for us as a family. And then, as is usually the case, after the rush and bustle of Christmas, when the adrenaline stops, I came down with whatever that bug is. I don't know whether it's traveled here, but it just wiped out the whole East Coast. And I literally could not get out of bed the day after Christmas. I was in my room. My 16-year-old knocked on the door and said, "Mommy, I'm just knocking on the door to see if you're still alive." I said, "I'm here, but I can't get out of bed, and don't come in because you do not want this." Well, it was laying in my bed late at night that I got a call that sort of jarred me out of my sort of troubled sleep, and it was a call from a friend of mine who I had been in a program with, the Rockwood Leadership Institute. One of the things that we talked about was this idea of courageous conversations, and so there was a special familiarity when I heard that reported today. But she called to say, "I've got some bad news." One of my colleagues, a woman by the name of Becky Tarbotton, had died. She'd been on vacation in Mexico. She'd gotten up in the morning with her new husband and her family and friends. They'd gone swimming, and she took in too much water. And although she was able to make it back to land, she drowned. And she died. And, you know, I was still in this sort of feverish state. I made a phone call to another colleague and shared the information, but then I was just out. And it was the next morning that I began to feel a little bit better, and I was still kind of in denial. So I said, well, let me just see if I can make some sense out of all of this. And so I went to the website. She works for an organization. She was the executive director of an organization called the Rainforest Action Network, RAN. And so I went to the website to think maybe there's an obituary. I need to see a picture of her. I need to make this real. And there was the obituary, and there was a link to a YouTube video of her giving a speech. And so I watched this video over and over again. And here was this wonderful, smart, strong, poised, beautiful woman, and she was gone. And as I listened to her speech, I discovered the theme of my reflections that I want to share with you for today. She started by quoting Dr. King. Now, this was an environmentalist who wasn't even born when Dr. King was engaged in the struggle. And she started by saying, you know, if you want to solve the problem, you can't do it from the level of the problem. You have to rise above the problem, she said, as she quoted Dr. King. And then she also went on to say, we must fundamentally change the way we live. Now, she was speaking to a room full of environmentalists, but I think her message is equally appropriate for people who are committed to the cause of human and civil rights. So, what does all this have to do with Dr. King and what I want to talk to you about today? Well, I think the first lesson is a stark reminder of the universal truth of our mortality. You know, we don't know how long any of us have, and we don't know when our time is going to come, and I think part of the lesson is, and I feel it deeply in this room, is that the people in this room know we have to make every minute count. And we have to make every minute count to make Dr. King's vision, which is a broader vision, a reality. You know, we can jazzercise it, we can Botox it, we can nip it and tuck it, we can vacation it, but at the end of the day, we are mortal. And so we have to make sure that we are living every minute with that understanding that we're making a difference. But it also made me think about, and this is the sort of the deeper struggle, when we're dealing with the death penalty, what is it that we really are doing? Are we struggling to try and pretend, you know, there's Botox and there's jazzercise, but isn't the death penalty and the way we've approached our criminal justice system almost the same kind of thing? Aren't we just piling up sandbag upon sandbag of policy, hoping that the levy of our mortality won't show? You know, part of it, what we're struggling against is the possibility that we will lose people that we love, and we don't know how to deal with that. You know, it's one thing, you know, as difficult as it is, as it was to lose Becky, there was some comfort in knowing she was with her family, and she was making the choice for what she wanted to do. It is a far more difficult and unsettling idea to think about how do we deal when a loved one is taken from us by another one of us, where we think their last thoughts and experiences were fear and pain. That's a lot to grapple with. And so when we deal with the death penalty, we have to acknowledge that we're dealing with a fundamental, deep, and real fear and challenge that we have to address. And so it's understandable that we want to pile those sandbags up, but that's really getting at the problem from the level of the problem. And so we have to really address it a little differently. Okay, so when we're dealing with our criminal justice system at the level of the problem, we're talking about more jails and more punishment and more how can we do something meaner to this person. We're talking about violence for violence, repaying hate for hate. But if we hover, as Dr. King would have us do, a little above the problem, we see that the problem is violence. And so I was so glad to hear that testimony about nonviolence is not weakness. It's not doing nothing. That's the hardest part. You know, it's so easy to fix a problem with the violence. It's much harder to deal with it at a higher level. So, what does this mean in practical terms? I think when it talks about this higher vision, dealing with the problem from a higher level, we have to address violence. It means that we must prioritize providing families with the support that they need to be whole and healthy. It means livable wages for families. It means decent working conditions and It means health care benefits that provide care for people with mental illness and people with acute mental illness. It means resources and support for teachers so that they can have time to partner with parents to take care of our children, to see when there are problems and to address them before they get out of control. I remember I'm not as young as my colleague who's passed away. I was alive when Dr. King was born, and I remember sort of whispers. When Dr. King was marching about, sitting at the counters and getting on the bus, that's all right. When we started talking about poverty and the Vietnam War and economic justice, he's getting far afield. He's getting far afield. But what he was doing was getting at the heart of the problem. So as people who are committed to criminal justice reform, as people who are committed to ending the death penalty, we have to understand that if we're going to address this problem really, and the problem is violence, we have to make sure that we are engaged in the conversations that really address it. It means that we have to support conflict resolution in our schools. When kids are given tools to resolve their concerns using their words and using their reason, you will see there's much less violence. I've seen this in my own children's school. From the very beginning, pre-K kindergarten, they're trained in conflict resolution. And so, the funny story is, it gets to the point where they're trained as kids, and then in the 5th grade, you get to be a conflict resolution counselor. And so, I'm always kind of pushing mom, like, oh, Aaron, I want you to get that training, it's going to look good on your resume. So, from his perspective, it's like, you get to wear a hat and pizza with the principal. Well, I finally managed to I couldn't get my older son, I got my younger son to participate in this program, and all the kids are going through it. So, in 5th grade, they have these shifts that you go on the playground and you wear your hat, and if there's a problem, the conflict resolution counselors step in. And so I remember asking him one day coming home from school, I said, well, Aaron, how is that going? He says, Mommy, it's really, really boring. And I said, why? He says, because there are no fights. I said, I was so bored I tried to start a fight. So it does work. It does work, and I think that's about dealing with violence at the very, very early stages and addressing it. I also think it means that we have to acknowledge how insidious violence is in our society. We have to name it. And it talks about, when we talk about fundamentally changing the way that we live, we have to recognize it's hard because we accept violence as a way of life in so many ways. Some of my friends and family members have decided to go gluten-free. I don't know how many of you have ever been, tried to do that, but once you start going gluten-free, you realize it's everything. And so it's sort of the same way with violence. I mean, once you wake up to the role of violence, you realize it's in everything, and you can't stop all of it, but you can at least name it. So when we're sitting with our kids and we're watching TV or we're looking at a game, you may not be the censor in your house, but you can say, I think that's violence. And so just naming it begins to address it a little bit. So to talk about what this all means in the context of the criminal justice system, I know from speaking with Rosemary that last year this group focused on Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow. And I think that is one of the most important books that we could ever have, and we're lucky to have it. And I think it really goes to this idea about whether we're far afield when we start looking at some of these other issues, or whether we're right where we ought to be. Because the main premise of that book is that when we start talking about the criminal justice system, we've been sold a lot. We've been told that the current system that we have is about keeping us safe, that this is the safety paradigm. But the reality is, it has nothing to do with safety. If you look at the track record of the policies that are in that paradigm, they have nothing to do with safety. Death penalty is one of the chief lies. If we're in a safety paradigm, you would think that states that have the death penalty and use it like Texas and some of these other places would be safer, but they're not. You would think that we would not be experiencing the violence that we're experiencing because we have the death penalty. But it's not. It's a lie. And I think that part of Dr. King's vision and part of what we have to be about is addressing that lie. And I think when once you get out of that frame, you realize that there are other things that we might want to do that can keep us safe. To give you another good example about how this safety framework and the criminal justice system may not even be the thing that we ought to be talking about. Maybe we ought to be talking about public health. I mean, there was a time when public health, there were people trying to have us think about public violence as a public health issue, you know, and how you approach a public health issue is very different from the way we're approaching our crime issue. Let me give you a good example. Just a couple of days ago, there was a new report that I saw released. It actually came out, it was, I guess it was reported on Mother Jones magazine, but there was been a study about the relationship between violence and the level of lead in the air. Has anybody heard about that? Mm-hmm. And so, as it turns out, we've seen a decline in the crime rate and the violence rate. And this study shows pretty convincingly to me that it had less to do perhaps with all these various criminal justice policies we have in place, but more to do with the fact that as we've changed our standards for lead emissions in the air, that young people and children have not been subject to the effects of lead. And so, again, we have to think outside the box that we've been given in order to actually get at the real problem. You know, I got about 5 minutes, and so I'm not going to share with you all the statistics that we know about the death penalty and how the death penalty is used overwhelmingly when the victim is white as opposed to when the victim is a person of color. I'm not going to talk to you about the fact that there are over 142 people who've been released from death row because of innocence, and the relationship between race and the risk of being wrongfully convicted. I'm just going to talk about one case which I think epitomizes the lie, and that's the Troy Anthony Davis case. How many people have heard about that case? Okay, now that is a case where the state of Georgia executed that man even though there was overwhelming doubt of his guilt. Witnesses recanted, no physical evidence tying him to the crime. And the thing that for me was the most frustrating and disheartening and compelling thing is that there were millions of people. The NAACP led a major campaign, Amnesty International, and our voices saying, look, whatever, you know, this is, you were doing this in our name. Our voices did not matter. And so that case, for me, is sort of the epitome of why we need to end the death penalty. In Colorado, in Georgia, in Maryland, because at the end of the day, it is inconsistent with the vision that we have about humanity. If it doesn't even matter whether this is the person who did it, how can we have a vision of humanity? If it doesn't matter that race plays a controlling role in who is selected for death and who is not, if it doesn't matter that when our criminal justice system uses its most expensive punishment, its most severe punishment, that it values the lives of some victims more than others, how can we have the death penalty and stay true to Dr. King's vision? And so when people talk to you about the death penalty and say, well, I don't know if we should get rid of it, you talk to them about Dr. King's vision. And you say to them, we can debate about the facts, and the facts are stubbornly on our side. But what we're talking about is Dr. King's vision. And Dr. King's vision is a world without violence. And we cannot have the death penalty, which is all about violence. Repaying pain for pain and having this vision. And so I am so heartened to be here today. I'm so pleased to be here with you today because you are living Dr. King's vision. And I know you'll be working with Rosemary and Lisa Cisneros and many others who are working to end the death penalty in Colorado. But know that when you do this, you are doing something larger than yourselves. You are giving life and breath to Dr. King's vision of a world where people are valued and our strongest weapon is love. Thank you.